that a blanket, a comforter, or a quilt also disappeared from the Matthews home. Some experiences are hard to forget. Some experiences are hard to forget. Again, the words of the defendant, this time not in a court pleading, in a letter written to the chief investigator of the Weld County District Attorney's Office. Not a misquote, not taken out of context. Some experiences are hard to forget. The words of the defendant, ladies and gentlemen. For 36 years, Jonelle Matthews laid barren field by this man. Death penalty and experiences that he had. I want to introduce you to, on December 20th, 19 on her way to her 13th. She was born February 9th, 1970. Just 6 weeks after she was born. Her mother Gloria and her older sister Jennifer. Family. You'll hear this. Janelle. They lived in California, ultimately settled in 1978. Jim came here for work. Elementary school principal. A lot of description about Janelle. She was loud. She was in the room. She was, and you always did know that Janelle was around. December 20th, 1984, up on Christmas, a time that the Christmas tree is out in the home of the gifts for her friends. And you'll hear about gifts for her friends. The honor choir, View Church of the Nazarene. This church and through school, Janelle developed an extremely large group of friends. It was the social gathering place. For Bronco games on Sundays. I just knew Janelle was there. Walk home from Franklin in the 7th grade. Occasionally she would, and her mom would give her the honor choir, Janelle and her to sing at a Christmas concert. And not unusually, she got a ride home. She wanted the opportunity to perform on December 20th, 1984. The District 6 administrator. That's Janelle. You'll see clips of this choir concert at the back row and work. To McDonald's with her father. Had gone to Greeley Central High School for a basketball game. And her mom, Gloria, had her parents who were ailing in California for the family meeting before everybody left. There's a clear understanding of when Gloria was leaving and what the plans were for the evening. As you can see, Janelle had on a red blouse, a gray sweater vest, a gray plaid skirt with a slip underneath it, pantyhose, and dark black dress shoes. To that concert, she also wore a blue nylon parka type jacket. Also at that concert was her friend Deanna Ross, one of Jonelle's best friends in the world. A friend from church, a friend from school. They would all the time spend the night at each other's homes. Parents would give each other's children rides home after events. And on December 20th, 1984, Jonelle got a ride home from Deanna and her father, Russ Ross. You'll hear much more about Russ Ross here in a bit, but at this point, it's important to note Ross and Deanna Ross recalled dropping home, watched her walk inside, saw a light turn on inside the home, and they left, knowing that Jonelle was now safe inside. Mind you, it's 1984, and they went to their home at 403 North 66th Avenue. They also both recall that it was about 8:20 in the evening when they dropped Jonelle off. Now, between 8:30 and 8:40, we know that a substitute teacher by the name of Sandy Snap, who worked at the elementary school where Mr. Matthews was the principal, called the Matthews home because she was ill and she needed a substitute teacher for the next day. She recalls talking to what she believed to be a very young girl and leaving a message that she needed a phone call back for a substitute since she couldn't be at school. She recalls having to repeat that message several different times to make sure that the message was getting through, believing that she was talking to a 4 or a 5-year-old child. She later told police that had she known she was talking to a 12-year-old, she would have called the police. Can we have exhibit 33, please? Thank you. This is the phone inside the Matthews home. Take a look, we could zoom in on that, please. There's the note you can see. Sandy Stamp, need a sub, written by Janelle. You'll hear at 8:40 that night, there was a neighbor boy named Jason C. who was sitting in his bedroom. His back window faced the Matthews backyard, and he hears his dog begin to bark incessantly, very out of character, as you'll hear. And he couldn't get the dog to stop barking. He was barking directly at the backyard, the fence that divided his home from the Matthews home. Jim Matthews returned back home after watching his daughter Jennifer play basketball, and he gets home about 9:30. Mr. Matthews walks in the home, yells, "Hi, Janelle," goes downstairs to wrap a Christmas present. He didn't get a response. But at that first moment, nothing particularly odd was crossing Mr. Matthews' mind. So he started to wrap the present, he walked back out, and he realized he hadn't heard Janelle. So he repeats himself, "Hi, Janelle." No response. He walks out into the living room area in the basement. He sees that the television is on, the space heater is on, the chair in the foreground, a chair where Janelle often sat and watched television, worked on her Christmas presents for her friends. On the couch on the right-hand side of that photograph, for the record, this is People's Exhibit number 41, you see Janelle's pantyhose. At the base of that chair, you see the dress shoes that she wore to the concert. And when you get this exhibit, if you look closely, over the top of one of her shoes is a piece of red thread, similar to that which would be used for cross-stitching. Mr. Matthews looked around the home, and other than a jewelry box that was in his and Gloria's bedroom, which was laying open, albeit nothing seemingly missing from that jewelry box, nothing seemed out of place. Mr. Matthews called Russ Ross at about 10 o'clock that evening to make sure that he had in fact gotten Janelle home. And when he gets confirmation that yes, in fact, Deanna and I dropped Janelle off at the home, he called his pastor, Jim Christie, for guidance, advice. What do? I can't find my daughter. Jennifer gets home from the basketball game, and Mr. Matthews tells her that they can't find Janelle. She suggests they start calling friends. No response. No one has seen Janelle. At 11:14, the Greeley Police Department is called. Now, contrary to what we hear in the social media, ladies and gentlemen, police don't wait 24 hours, 48 hours before beginning to act upon a missing child, particularly a 12-year-old missing child 5 days before Christmas. You'll hear that Officer Dave Mathis was the first officer to respond, followed closely by other officers, including Detective Jack Stollard. And as they start looking around the outside of the Matthews home, they see footprints in the snow. Shoe prints are on the back of the Matthews home, up a back staircase to a deck that leads to a landing to the back door, kitchen door. Similar shoe prints from the front porch area, walking in front of the Matthews home, back towards the front porch. And they also notice something interesting. The shoe prints in the backyard have been raked out, obliterated by a hard rake. Exhibit 10. Obliterated by a hard rake very similar to one that was in the Matthews garage. When they go in the garage, they see a grease spot or an oil spot as if a car had leaked some oil. And there are some very distinctive similar shoe prints in the grease, in the oil, in the garage of the Matthews home as well. The evidence of this raking in Exhibit 10 and other exhibits that you'll see was held very close to the vest by the Greeley Police Department for years and years, knowing that the only other people who would, or other person who would know that that raking occurred was the person who did it. Years later, Jennifer Matthews did not know that the snow in the back of her house was raked. That's how close to the vest the police department kept this. Having seemingly vanished into thin air, Janelle was missing for the next 35 years. Now, here in Greeley, this was enormous news. Missing persons posters with Janelle's face were everywhere. A community was terrified. The news media came up and covered the story almost on a daily basis. Television production companies did recreations of her disappearance, trying to get the word out about Janelle being missing. Even President Ronald Reagan mentioned Janelle by name in a speech about the epidemic of missing children to a national newspaper organization. Janelle was one of the first children featured on milk cartons under the phrase, "Have you seen me?" That is, of course, until July 23rd of 2019. On that date, an oil and gas crew installing a pipeline out near County Road 49 and 34.5 here in Weld County were removing dirt for this pipeline when the blade of the bulldozer unearthed a human skull and what appeared to be clothing. You will hear the arduous process that a forensic anthropologist went through to collect the remains of Jonelle Matthews. Note very closely, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at Exhibit 73 and you look at Exhibit number 2, those are the same clothes. Janelle never even had time to change her clothes. And that's where she laid for 36 years. Immediately apparent both to the forensic anthropologist and the medical examiner, the coroner, who conducted an autopsy, was the cause and manner of death. Janelle was shot in the forehead. The upper right side of her forehead, the bullet traveling through her brain and exiting the base of her skull. Very likely looking at the defendant as he shot her. So how did we get here? How did we get to this trial date? Mr. Miller and Ms. Wells talked about this in jury selection over the last few days. You will not hear evidence of DNA. There is no DNA link between the defendant and Jonelle Matthews. And you'll hear, nor should we expect any. The experts will come in here and testify about the efforts that they made to collect DNA from Janelle's remains, from her clothing. But she will also tell you that the worst possible medium, the worst possible location to try and preserve DNA is buried in sand and soil exposed to the elements for nearly 36 years. They looked, but she fully expected not to be able to find DNA. It just isn't going to be there. You'll also hear that her home, the Matthews home in 1984, wasn't processed for what we call touch DNA. Touch DNA didn't exist in 1984. What you will hear over and over and over again, ladies and gentlemen, is the type of evidence older than time itself. Statements. Statements of the defendant. Statements and behaviors that will lead you to but one conclusion: that he is the individual we have been looking for 37 years. On January 17th, 1985, 3 weeks after Janelle's disappearance, nobody knew who Steve Pankey was. Nobody had heard of him. His name had not come up in the investigation. He wasn't a person of interest, and yet he picks up the phone. And he calls Detective Jack Stotler, and he identifies himself as an ordained Baptist minister. He claimed that he had contact with somebody who had information about Janelle's disappearance. But he didn't give up the information. Instead, what he did, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. You tell me, Detective Stotler, what your investigation has revealed to this point, and I'll let you know if it's consistent with the information that I have. Obviously, Detective Stotler, much like every other detective in the country, is not going to reveal at a very early stage the information that he's developing through the course of his investigation. So when he refuses to share that, the defendant terminates the phone call. 12 days later, the defendant shows up on his own accord to the Greeley Police Department to give an interview with an FBI agent named Don Lyon. For the first time, but certainly not for the last time, the defendant claimed that he had received this information through a pastoral confession, acting as a pastor, receiving information from somebody else who was responsible for Janelle's disappearance. Although he did say that he thought the person who had confessed to him just did so to try to impress the defendant. The rest of the conversation was spent denigrating Pastor Jim Christie of the Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene, claiming that he had untoward sexual affairs with many of the attendees at the church. To the FBI, to Agent Lyon, this interview, this discussion by the defendant, initiated by him, was so trivial, it didn't even warrant a report. It's not documented by the FBI. Yet to him, this was so critically important that he still spoke of this in November of 2019. Just merely 2 years ago, he gives an interview to a podcaster on a podcast called Unfound. And he says that following leaving the Greeley Police Department and following that interview with the FBI, he was pleasantly surprised at how easy the interviews were. And he slept really good, his words, for the first time in a long time. You will hear about the ties between the defendant and Russ Ross. And make no mistake about it, there's no love lost between those two, particularly the defendant in his views of Russ Ross. You'll hear that they worked together. You'll hear that the defendant sued him in a National Labor Relations Board act for trying to create a union at the 7-Up bottling plant here in Greeley. You'll hear that Russ Ross was one of the individuals who forcibly removed the defendant from the Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene in the mid to late 1978. And obviously, as we've talked about, you will hear that Russ Ross was the last person to have seen Jonelle Matthews alive. So I want to talk about a few of the things that the defendant has said over the course of time. In writings that I'll detail out in a few minutes, the defendant claims that on the evening of December 20th of 1984, he was at his home at 6086 West 10th Street with his 5-year-old son Mark and his wife Angela. And in this writing, he refers to this as a good alibi, not a great alibi. Ask yourself why he needs an alibi. He says he was at home, he was watching the weather conditions because they had a planned trip to leave to go to California the next day, December 21st, to visit his parents in Big Bear Lake, California. He talks about details like, I was drinking Pepsi, and I was looking out the window concerned about the snowfall because I wanted to make sure that my two-wheel drive car could get out of the driveway the next morning to go on this trip. Detectives, ladies and gentlemen, have contacted NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There was 1 inch of snow on the ground on December 20th of 1984. The high temperature that day was 38 degrees. There was no blizzard. There was no concern about getting out of a driveway. Yet that's what he claims. He says that as he's doing so, he sees a couple of different vehicles make U-turns in his driveway. And he thought it was law enforcement coming to serve him with some kind of papers. He claims that they left in the early morning hours of December 21st, making the 15 or 16-hour drive to Big Bear Lake, California, spending the Christmas holiday with his family, and returning to Greeley on December 26, 1984. For the next 37 years, he will repeatedly claim that he didn't even know who Jonelle Matthews was, never heard her name, knew nothing about the Matthews family until 6 days later. We know this version of events is not correct. And we know it's not correct because you will hear from the one other adult who was in the home December 20th, 1984, his wife, now ex-wife, Angela Hicks. She'll tell you that they were married in October of 1978. She will tell you that unequivocally he was never a pastor, never a minister, never a youth pastor, never an ordained minister in any church at any point in time. As I indicated, she will tell you that they lived at 6086 West 10th Street, which is a very narrow yet very long plot of land. The home sits towards the front third of the plot of land, and it goes back behind the house for quite a ways. She'll tell you that the defendant was a used car salesman, owning a used car dealership, if you will, called Aaron Auto, A-A-R-O-N Auto. And she will tell you that she recalls the evening of December 21st, the defendant all of a sudden comes home and makes the announcement that they're taking an unplanned trip to California the next day. She had never heard of this plan before. No car was packed, no luggage packed, nothing ready for Mark, their 5-year-old. We're leaving to go to California the next morning. That would be December 22nd, 1984. She recalls being shocked by this because she needs to plan. And immediately her first thought went to their dogs. What's going to happen to our dogs? The defendant said, I dumped them off. Angela Hicks never saw those dogs again. She will tell you that she was certain, that they packed their car in the early morning hours of December 22nd, and drove to California, arriving on December 23rd. She will tell you that for some inexplicable reason, they turn around and they leave and come home, leaving on Christmas, during the day on Christmas, to drive back to Greeley. And she will very clearly describe to you that as they're driving home, the defendant had her incessantly searching the radio for news accounts of the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. When they arrived back in Greeley, Angela was shocked to see that they drove right by their home to the Safeway store located on 10th Street and 35th Avenue in Greeley. And the defendant directed her to go into the store and beg for copies of the newspapers from the previous few days. Having very little change, that's exactly what Angela had to do, beg for the copies of the previous day's Greeley Tribunes. Once she returned, he had her sit in the vehicle and read to him repeatedly, not the entirety of the paper, but simply the stories about Jonelle's disappearance. Now, these two things are striking to her because, you see, in the Pankey home, there is no television, there's no radio allowed, and there's no newspapers. Once she finished reading the newspapers to him, they go home. And she will tell you that he immediately goes outside and starts digging in their front yard, claiming that there's a problem with their septic system. Confused, Angela goes inside, checks on the sinks, checks on the toilets. There's nothing wrong, yet he's digging incessantly in the front yard. Approximately 2 days later, Angela will tell you that she went outside their home and she sees a car in the very back portion of their property engulfed in flames. And she runs out, she says, "What in the world is going on?" And pardon my expression, and pardon my language, but he immediately tells her, "Get the fuck back inside." Kenny Anderson, who is the owner of Anderson Salvage here in Greeley, will come in and tell you that he remembers the defendant. He remembers the defendant bringing a car to him to sell for salvage. Not an unusual event in and of itself. But what he will remember is a car that the defendant brought to him that had experienced what Mr. Anderson calls a phony fire. Well, what's a phony fire? In his experience, cars that are engulfed in flames burn from the outside, burn from the engine block. This car, the phony fire car, was only burned on the inside. The strange occurrences and statements by the defendant, according to Angela Hicks, didn't stop there. In February of 1985, the Pankeys are now attending Faith Ministries Church here in Greeley. And you will hear that in roughly February, Angela recalls the pastor at Faith Ministries during a call for prayer talking about a vision that he had. That Janelle was alive and was going to be returned home safely. The defendant starts uttering to himself the words false prophet. Not just once, but over and over and over again. Becoming more and more angry at this notion that Janelle's alive and that she's going to be returned home, to the point where he has to be escorted out of the church because he continually repeats that angry phrase, false prophet. In 1999, Angela recalls that the defendant told her that the Sun Valley Police Department in Idaho, where they now lived, refused to believe that he has information about the Jonelle Matthews disappearance, and they refused to give him immunity in exchange for that evidence. We'll talk more about this notion of immunity in a few minutes. But Angela, apparently with a confused look on her face, is thinking to herself, Jonelle Matthews, I remember that girl. She disappeared in Greeley when we lived there. And the defendant, seeing her confused look, says, "You don't think I would have hurt her, do you? She looked just like me." On May 23rd of 1999, Angela was reviewing old newspaper articles because, see, they're still married. But she would go to the library and look at old newspaper articles, sneak them back home to try to figure out if maybe he had some responsibility for Jonelle Matthews' disappearance. And she had encountered a December 21st, 1984 Greeley Tribune article in which Greeley Police Lieutenant Paul Branham talked about the fact that there were signs of foul play at the Matthews home, but details were not being released. Along the side of that newspaper, Angela wrote the following phrase. One time when Steve was rambling, when he was rambling on, he talked about the snow being raked outside the Matthews house. He talked about the snow being raked outside of Janelle's home. Ladies and gentlemen, following his voluntary appearance at the Greeley Police Department in 1985, he wasn't even a blip on the radar screen for law enforcement. No one knew him. He showed up in one paragraph of one report by Detective Stotler, and he never showed up in the FBI reports. Yet, as you'll see, it's almost as if the defendant periodically and with increasing frequency would walk up to law enforcement, tap them on the shoulder, and say, "Here I am. Come get me." What do I mean by that? The statements that he makes to Angela Hicks are only the tip of the iceberg, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to talk through a few of the statements that he has made, not all of them, that you will hear throughout the course of this case. And please take note of this notion, which should be beyond dispute. The truth does not change. Reality cannot be twisted. Yet the defendant's story changes all the time. In 1986, he was contacted by the FBI agents at his home at 6086 West 10th Street on a completely unrelated matter, had nothing to do with Jonelle Matthews. In the course of that discussion, he tells that FBI agent, "I thought you were here to talk about Jonelle Matthews." He then talks about how the investigation into her disappearance should be directed towards certain members of the Son of You Church of the Nazarene, where the Matthews attended, because he knew of allegations regarding ritualistic group sex. Again, his words, not mine. Shortly after that interview with the FBI, he up and moved his family out of Greeley, bouncing around from place to place: Texas, Arkansas, California, Oregon, landing in Idaho. In the winter of 1996 into 1997, for some reason, in Ketchum, Idaho, the defendant was videotaping a traffic stop by an officer named Lee Edgerton, of a completely unrelated citizen. He was videotaping it. And when Officer Edgerton asked him to back away from where she was conducting this traffic stop, again, pardon my expression, he looks at her and says, "Don't fuck with me. I've buried more people than you know." And when she said to him, "Where have you buried people?" his immediate, direct, one-word answer was, "Colorado." 6 months later, the Ketchum, Idaho Police Department is investigating a disturbance that occurred at a restaurant, in part involving the defendant. And the defendant, claiming that he suffered from dyslexia, had an officer from the Ketchum Police Department write out his written statement for him. And amongst that written statement, unrelated to anything regarding Jonelle Matthews, the written statement written by Officer Nathan Taylor says, "Sun Valley, Idaho Police Department has created a lengthy file on me in regards to the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews in Greeley, Colorado over a decade ago. There is bad blood between the police and me. But you'll start to see the increasing frequency with which the defendant talks about Jonelle Matthews." On April 26, 1999, in a court pleading and filed in the Idaho Court of Appeals, he wrote, quote, "The appellant, him, is a master manipulator. It is almost certainty that the state will not be able to solve the 1985 disappearance of Miss Jonelle Matthews from a Colorado jurisdiction without the appellant's cooperation." He further argued in that same pleading, the state of Idaho, hopes the appellant will reveal the location of Miss Matthews' body. And he continued to argue in that same pleading that he had received information about this through some pastoral confession. As I started this morning with my quote, he wrote in a September 1999 pleading to the Idaho Supreme Court, "If the court affirms this frivolous matter, it is reasonable for the appellant to believe he would get the death penalty for revealing the location of Miss Matthews' body. The appellant cannot give closure to the Matthews family without taking names or taking the blame." On April 27th of 2003, he again wrote in a pleading to, this time an Idaho trial court, that he had entered the Greeley Police Department and told the detective that he had privileged information regarding the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews, and that he said that the victim's family, Jonelle's family, should be informed that she died before crossing 10th Street and not to give the family hope. In the same case, he went on to write, quote, "In late 1994, the defendant, through the Lincoln County prosecutor Jennifer Brown, acting as the defendant's attorney doing private work, contacted the Weld County, Colorado District Attorney's Office on behalf of the defendant and made an offer to District Attorney Al Dominguez in which the defendant would give the location of Jonelle Matthews' body in exchange for the DA acknowledging the defendant's knowledge of her disappearance was after the fact. And all of the defendant's conversations were privileged. And the defendant would not be charged in any related crime. District Attorney Al Dominguez agreed in a letter to Prosecutor Brown in the first paragraph But in the second paragraph, the basis of the agreement was clouded and the defendant would not cooperate without a clear agreement. You will hear from Jennifer Brown Ewer and former District Attorney Al Dominguez. None of that ever happened. In 2011, the defendant, now having abandoned his pastoral privilege argument, began writing letters to the District Attorney's office here in Weld County. And as you will see, he began to argue that he had no information about her disappearance or her death, and that he argued that any information that he received was after the fact. In one of those letters, dated June 1st of 2011, amongst other comments, he wrote, "The late Jonelle Matthews is at all times innocent in her death and disappearance." The late Jonelle Matthews. Ladies and gentlemen, her body wasn't found for 8 more years, and he's still referring to her as the late Jonelle Matthews. On April 10th of 2013, he wrote another letter in which he simply said, "The late Miss Matthews is 100% victim. She is not culpable." Unsatisfied with the lack of response that he got regarding these letters, he wrote the following, again, to law enforcement officials in Weld County. "If at a date certain, I went to the federal court in Boise, Idaho, and a federal district judge in open court on the record told me Colorado gave me blanket, irrevocable state and federal immunity regarding any and all Jonelle Matthews issues, I would be a happy man. I would be then free to say nothing at all or to say a lot. The ball is in your court, Mr. Olson." Keith Olson was the chief investigator at the Weld County District Attorney's Office in 2013. We have 178, please. August 15th, 2013. This is the letter I started with that I read to you. "For about a week after the fact, I realized a blanket or comforter or quilt also disappeared from the Matthews house. Some experiences are hard to forget, but I must realize justice isn't always served and move on." Signed by the defendant. Thank you. These are just a couple of the letters that he authored. But he didn't stop there. Finally, Detective Cash, in reviving this case and working this case from about 2013, 2014, starts to see some of these letters popping up in the investigation. And he thinks, well, I at least need to dot all the I's, cross the T's. I'm going to give Mr. Pankey a call and find out what's going on with these letters. So he does so on April 8th of 2019. You'll hear the recording of that phone call. You will hear that he was contacted not as a person of interest, but as a witness. And during that phone conversation, he will again claim he didn't know anything about Jonelle Matthews until 6 days later, but then says, I need a deal. I need a deal to talk to you. And Detective Cash makes it clear. In Colorado, there's something called the statute of limitations. Certain crimes can't be charged after a period of time, except murder and kidnapping. And Detective Cash makes that clear to the defendant. And he still says, I'm not going to talk to you without a deal. After Jonelle's remains were discovered on July 23rd of 2019, he immediately posted a comment to a Greeley Tribune article online that says, without a deal, this case may never be resolved. His own words, his own post on the Greeley Tribune. On August 4th of 2019, the Greeley Tribune ran an article about Jonelle being one of the first milk carton kids, like I talked about. And on that online article, the defendant posted the following comment. Because in the article, Jennifer Matthews, talked about how this operated as some closure for the Matthews family, the discovery of Jonelle's remains. The defendant wrote, there is no such thing as closure. my 20-year-old son Carl was murdered on July 4th of 2008. Losing a child hurts your entire life. I am fortunate to have truthful facts regarding Carl's murder, his son. The United States Attorney for the District of Colorado needs to actively oversee the investigation into the death and disappearance of Miss Jonelle Matthews, a human being. Since 1984, police have only considered sinister, emotionally charged child abduction possibilities, and they are culpable with resulting vigilantism. The public deserves the uncensored truth, even if that hurts the reputation of local law enforcement. Pray for truth, not revenge. Let's talk about the murder of his son for a moment. His son was murdered on July 4th of 2008. And Angela Hicks will tell you, that in the days before the funeral service, she saw the defendant standing over the urn of his son's ashes. And she heard him say, "I hope God didn't let this happen because of Jonelle Matthews." Intrigued by the April phone call that Detective Cash had with the defendant, Detective Mike Pearl, Detective Robert Cash went to Idaho to contact the defendant. The entirety of that interaction is audio recorded, and you will hear that recording as well during the course of this trial. And you will hear that he demanded immunity before making any statement. I've talked and used that word a couple of different times, immunity. What is immunity? Immunity is an agreement by a local prosecutor not to file charges, not to file any charges in exchange for information. The defendant repeatedly demanded immunity before sharing any information that he had at all. At the end of his conversation with Detective Prill, he said, "My fear is that I didn't do enough up front to prevent," and his voice trailed off as he was talking about Janelle. Notice this, ladies and gentlemen, the truth doesn't change. But in an interview that the defendant gave to the Idaho Statesman on September 13th of 2019, for the first time, he claimed that he heard from his father-in-law, who worked for a cemetery on December 21st of 1984, that someone asked about getting rid of a body. And he claimed that he gave this same information to the FBI. Now, to the Idaho Statesman, that's the sum and substance of that statement. But he repeated that same assertion September 18th of 2019 in a videotaped interview with an NBC affiliate in Boise, Idaho. And in that interview, which you will hear and see, he said, quote, "The next day was December 27th. Excuse me, I misspoke. December 27th is when he claims to have talked to his father-in-law. My father-in-law came over, and I was really not on speaking terms with my father-in-law, so I was surprised that he came there. He was a groundskeeper at the cemetery, and he said a cop had come to him and said that he had a body that he needed to have buried underneath a casket and that it would look bad for Steve." Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, Harold Hicks, Angela's father, died October 1st, 1997. He also then confirmed in that same interview with the reporter that he's the one that posted, "Without a deal, this case may never be resolved." And when the reporter wisely asks, "Well, what kind of a deal are you looking for?" he chuckles and says, "Well, not necessarily for me." On October 5th of 2019, in an unsolicited message to television reporters in Boise, Idaho, the defendant for the first time commented upon the ethnicity of Janelle. And he wrote in this message, "Hispanic 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews disappeared from her Greeley, Colorado home December 20th, 1984. Her body was miraculously found in July of 2019 in an area known and regularly patrolled by law enforcement. Whether her death was first degree, second degree, or third degree murder, she tragically lost her life. The innocent, Janelle, and her birth mother, Terry Martinez. In August of 2019, Janelle was buried with human dignity. The community deserves to know why. And then in the same message, he goes on to identify the people that he believes are persons of interest that should be looked at in Janelle's disappearance. Russ Ross, Mayor John Gates, Greeley Police Chief Mark Jones, and the defendant. He named himself as a person of interest. On November 4th of 2019, the defendant gave the podcast interview that I alluded to very briefly, entitled Unfound. And you'll have an opportunity to listen to that interview as well. But pay particular attention because once again, his story changed. In that interview, he said, at roughly 10 a.m. on December 27th, 1984, Angela's father arrived unannounced and approached him as he was working outside his home. This time he says that Harold commented, quote, a cop came to the cemetery and talked to him that he needed a body, he had a body that needed to be buried, something about a casket, putting it in a casket, and that it would look bad for Steve. This time he said that he specifically told the FBI back in 1985 that it was a cop who wanted this body disposed of. And he also went on to say that he is of the firm belief that the Greeley Police Department for 36 years knew exactly where Janelle was buried, and it's simply a miraculous occurrence that the oil and pipeline workers found her, because Greeley knew where she was the whole time. 6 days later, November 10th of 2019, he authored what he entitled a public letter. And he wrote, by casting suspicion on Steve Pankey while the white Greeley police detectives give the impression they're doing something to solve the Jonelle Matthews case. In reality, Hispanic Jonelle Matthews and Steve Pankey are disposable people to white GPD and the white Colorado news media. 12 days later, he offered a new theory as to what happened to Janelle. In what he entitled Public Exhibit A, he wrote the following. Consider a theory less sinister than kidnapping and murder. An injured 12-year-old agrees to accompany a trusted adult to an emergency room on 16th Street, dying along the way. In a state of confusion and remorse, the trusted adults, with no criminal history, contacts a cop friend. An unethical, repulsive, despicable plan is implemented containing a statute of limitation. He goes on to write, the unethical cops of 1984 are now, in 2019, the Greeley mayor and the police chief. Now, you may be wondering at this point, where did we get all these? Where did all these writings come from? Some of them came from Angela, and she'll testify about that. But you'll also hear of a search warrant that was conducted at his home in Twin Falls, Idaho by Detective Perla, Detective Cash, and local Idaho Police Department officials. That search warrant authorized them to collect such items as his Apple MacBook, an iPad, and 3 iPhones. And once back to Colorado, all of those devices were searched. The data downloaded for inspection by detectives, and you'll hear that the manner in which these devices were downloaded still allows for the recovery of information that he deleted from his devices, as long as that device hasn't gone through its normal programming and also subsequently deleted them. In other words, he's deleted them, the device hasn't deleted them yet. The data that was collected dates back to September of 2016 on these devices. It is not a stretch, ladies and gentlemen, to say that there are thousands of searches by him for information on Jonelle Matthews. Thousands. Not as of the day that Detective Cash called and started talking to him as a person of interest. No. Long before that. You will see that it is a norm in that man's life to search for information regarding Jonelle Matthews' case. Thousands of times. As important as the information that you will see is the information that he deleted from his devices, amounting to an affirmative act on his part to hide what he was doing. You will also see and hear that this information puts into context many of the things that he does over the course of this investigation. And let me just give you one example in the interest of time. On August 17th of 2019, it's clear that the defendant on one of his devices goes on and reviews a website posted by the Colorado State University journalism class regarding the investigation into the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. In that website, there are quotes by Detective Cash and others about DNA and how there is not and will not be able to be a link between DNA on Janelle, or lack thereof, and any suspect. It's clear there's no DNA. What does he do? 2 days later, voluntarily picks up the phone, walks into the police department in Idaho and says, I want to voluntarily give my DNA. That's going to be a surefire way to show that I didn't have anything to do with this, after he knows there's no DNA in this case. Ladies and gentlemen, for 37 years, justice for Janelle has been denied. That changes beginning today. The evidence in this case will prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based upon reason and common sense, that the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree and second-degree kidnapping. The search for justice for Janelle begins today. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Work. Mr. Buresh, you need some time to coordinate things. Very well. We'll take a relatively quick break. Let's take a break until 10:05. I'll advise you again that until the trial is completed, you must not discuss this case with anyone. That includes your family, people involved in the trial, other jurors, or anyone else. Someone approaches you and tries to discuss the trial with you, please let me know about it immediately. It's also important that you must not read or listen to any news reports of the trial. Do not in any way try to gain any information about this case outside the courtroom. That includes refraining from researching on the internet, medical or law books, encyclopedias or dictionaries. The social media advisement continues throughout the trial. Finally, it is especially important that you do not form or express any opinion on the case until it is finally submitted to you. So with that, let's say you safe, let's say 10 after 10. All right, please rise. Please be seated. And the court continues on the record in 20 CR 1866. Parties and counsel are present. The jurors are present. Mr. Viorst, you have an opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are three things I want to talk to you about this morning. First of all, I want to tell you why Steve Pankey is innocent. Secondly, I want to tell you about why the circumstantial evidence that was just discussed by the prosecutor is misleading in this case. And thirdly, I want to talk to you about who actually murdered Jonelle Matthews. All right, so let me start with why Steve Pankey is innocent. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that Steve Pankey did not know and had never met anyone in the Matthews family, including Janelle. And Gloria Matthews, who I believe is going to testify here in a moment, as well as Jim Matthews, the mother and father of young Jonelle Matthews, will both say, when Steve Pankey was arrested in this case, we don't know this guy. We'd never met him. We never saw him. We never talked to him. We knew nothing about him. And that's an important fact, because there's no other reason why, there's no reason why Steve Pankey would have done this. He did not know any of these people. He had no interest in them. They had no interest in him. And there was no connection whatsoever. So there's no motive. And I know we talked about this yesterday, and it's true that the prosecutor does not have to prove motive, and yet there is none in this case as far as Steve Pankey is concerned. What would be a possible motive? Well, a possible motive would be if someone had a sexual interest in Jonelle Matthews, and sadly, there are people in the world who prey on young children, some of whom have a sexual interest in those young children. And actually, I think you will hear, ladies and gentlemen, I believe, based on the information we have at this time, you will hear that Jonelle Matthews she was 12 years old, but she was, I think the word that is used is developed. She was developed. She had reached puberty. So she wasn't a very young girl, but she was still 12 years old, and kind of girl that certainly Mr. Pankey would have had no interest in, but there are people who do have an interest in those types of girls, and we'll talk about why the person who did this actually was interested in Janelle and her developing body. But Mr. Pankey was not. And the evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that Mr. Pankey only had an interest in adults. And the evidence will show, and I believe Angela Pankey will say that, well, he was, and again, I don't want to be crude, but we do have to talk about these things. He was sexually interested in her, his wife, but that also she knew, based on some things she had seen on his computer, that he had an interest in adult females. And that's all she ever saw on his computer. She never had any reason to believe he ever had any interest in young girls. And in fact, he didn't have an interest in young girls. Now, there is some evidence, and I believe it will come out, you'll hear, that perhaps Mr. Pankey also has an interest in men. Today's day and age, I'm hopeful that would not be held against him. But again, these would be adult men, adult women, never children. Never children. And that's really what Jonelle Matthews was. Mr. Pankey is innocent, ladies and gentlemen, because there is no physical evidence, really no evidence whatsoever, connecting him to this crime. So DNA, all right, the prosecutors explained the absence of DNA, and yeah, we're not gonna say at the end of this case, ooh, they didn't present any DNA evidence, because it's true, in 1984, DNA was not traceable. So we can't hold them to that standard. But there's also no fingerprints connecting Mr. Pankey to this crime, and their fingerprint technology did exist at that time. And I think you'll hear that there were fingerprints of Mr. Pankey's that do not match fingerprints found at the scene. There's no shoe prints. I understand that the prosecution is saying, well, there were some shoe prints that were raked over, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But whatever those shoe prints were that were raked over, they were never connected to Mr. Pankey in any way. There's no witness identification of Mr. Pankey, obviously. No identification of a vehicle that Mr. Pankey was driving, and no signs of a struggle. Now, why is signs of a struggle important, ladies and gentlemen? Well, Mr. Rourke just said, and I quote him, Janelle was loud and energetic. And you will hear, ladies and gentlemen, that she was loud and energetic. She was a very, energetic, vibrant young girl. And I think at least one person will say that, if someone had tried to abduct her, she would have fought. She would have fought them off if she didn't know them. But if it was someone she knew, someone she was familiar with, she very likely would have gotten into a car with that person voluntarily. And that's important because there's zero evidence, ladies and gentlemen, zero evidence of any kind of struggle. And you heard, during Mr. Rourke's opening statement, you heard him say, everything in that house was in order. There may have been a jewelry box that had been opened, but nothing was taken from it. You don't even know if Janelle was the one who opened that jewelry box. But there was, nothing in that house was disturbed. There was no struggle. And that is because, ladies and gentlemen, it's more likely the person who entered the home was someone Janelle knew than someone she didn't. And if a stranger, which Mr. Pankey was, and again, I don't think anyone is going to dispute that Mr. Pankey was a stranger to Jonelle Matthews. If someone like Mr. Pankey had abducted her, she would have kicked and screamed and fought, and someone would have heard it. And no one did. And the house, there's nothing in the house to suggest there was a struggle. All right. Mr. Pankey was home that night. You're going to hear there's a dispute in this case about which night they went to California. But they did go to California to see Mr. Pankey's family in Big Bear, California. But regardless, I think even Angela Hicks, Mr. Pankey's ex-wife, will say she has no recollection of Mr. Pankey ever being gone for an extended period of time on either the night before they left or 2 nights before they left. So, it's not clear whether they left on December 20th. Jonelle Matthews was abducted and murdered on December 20th of '84. Perhaps into the early morning hours of December 21st. There's no indication that so there's a dispute. Did they leave then to go to California on the 21st, the morning of the 21st, or the morning of the 22nd? I'm not sure it makes a big difference, but suffice it to say that Angela Hicks will acknowledge that she had no reason to believe that Mr. Pankey was gone for an extended period of time on either of those nights. At least nothing, she doesn't remember anything about that, for sure. All right. And Mr. Pankey has said, and I think his statements will come into evidence, and I believe they were referenced in the opening statement, he has said, I was home that night. I was home the night of the 20th. All right. Jonelle Matthews was murdered during a very, very discrete period of time. All right? And you're going to hear about that. And it was a really unusual situation in the Matthews home, because Gloria Matthews went to visit her ailing parents that day, earlier that day, December 20th. And as I understand it, and she'll testify herself, but as I understand it, she wasn't a person who traveled a ton, and so it was unusual for her to have left that day to go visit her parents and leave, Jim Matthews in charge. There's no reason that Mr. Pankey would have ever known that. In addition, it just so happened that night, the Matthews had two girls. They had Jennifer, the older daughter, and Janelle, the younger. And it just so happened that night they both had activities. And again, that's, I think, fairly unusual. I mean, I guess it's not impossible. If you have two kids, they could each have an activity planned. But it just so happened that this was a night, the evening. It wasn't like a soccer game or something in the middle of the afternoon. It was an evening in the middle of the week. And it just so happened that Jennifer had a basketball game at her school, and Janelle had a concert at a local bank or a local establishment. And it was a choir concert with her school, but it wasn't at the school. And again, there's no way anyone in Mr. Pankey's position would have known that. There's no way. Just that both girls were gone at that moment. And then it just so happened, ladies and gentlemen, that Jim Matthews decided to watch the basketball game rather than the concert. It could have gone the other way. But he went to the basketball game to watch his older daughter, and I think before he went to the game, I think the evidence will show he dropped Janelle off at the school, and the school then drove her to the concert site in a bus. After the concert, she drove back on the bus to the school, and from the school home. But Jim Matthews, after he dropped her off at her school, went to, I believe, Jennifer's school and watched her basketball game, and he was gone for several hours. So Janelle got home, and as far as the timing is concerned, there'll be some discussion about that, but somewhere 8:15, 8:30-ish. And when she got home, Jim Matthews then did not get home for another full hour, So there was this 1 hour of opportunity for the murderer to abduct Jonelle Matthews. But somebody in Steve Pankey's position, who was a stranger to the family, knew nothing about them, would never have known that. Now, again, they don't have to necessarily prove exactly how this happened, but again, we talked about common sense, and there has to be some explanation, I think, in your minds as to how this could have happened in order for you to convict my client. And so I think what they're going to say is that Mr. Pankey followed Russ Ross home. Now, Russ Ross, so let me talk about Russ Ross for a minute. Russ Ross, and he's going to testify, if not today, then tomorrow, perhaps later this afternoon. And Russ Ross, he did used to work with Mr. Pankey at 7-Up. Mr. Pankey worked there for several years. I don't know how much bad blood there is between Mr. Pankey and Mr. Ross. I guess Mr. Ross can testify to that himself. I don't think they were close friends, certainly by the time Mr. Pankey left that company. But I'm not sure they were mortal enemies either. But I think there may have been some animosity there. We'll find But either way, I mean, I guess the theory would be that Mr. Pankey happened to be at Janelle's school when Russ Ross. So by the way, let me back up for a minute. Russ Ross drove Janelle home that night, and Russ Ross's daughter Deanna was a friend of Janelle's. But again, it was not planned that Russ Ross was going to drive her home. It just so happened Janelle got back to the school, and her dad wasn't there because he was at the basketball game with the older daughter. So she needed a ride home, and so Russ Ross, drove his daughter's best friend home. That's what he did, and that's perfectly normal. So, but it wasn't planned because Jim Matthews, Jonelle's father, didn't call Russ Ross and say, will you drive Janelle home? I don't believe that's what the evidence is going to show. Again, Jim Matthews will testify and he'll speak for himself, but I believe the evidence will show that it wasn't really a particular definite plan made. It was just that Janelle got dropped off at the school, she needed a ride home, Russ Ross was driving Deanna, his own daughter, home. I think it was on the way, and he drove. But even if it wasn't, it was his daughter's best friend, he drove her home. Perfectly normal. But the only reason I bring this out is because, again, it wasn't planned. So it wasn't like whoever did this would have known that Russ Ross was going to be driving Jonelle Matthews home. So I guess the theory is that somehow Mr. Pankey was I don't know if maybe he was following Russ Ross around town, or maybe he was just at the school hanging out. I don't know. But then somehow he followed Russ Ross's vehicle to Janelle's home. I guess that's the theory. But here's the problem with that theory, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence will show, and again, beyond, I don't think any real dispute, that Russ Ross's vehicle, Russ Ross was driving, Russ Ross dropped Jonelle Matthews off at her home and then kept going to his own home. So if a person had a beef with Russ Ross, presumably the person would keep following Russ Ross and not stop at the home of a family that he didn't know and never met and had no interest in. And again, and at a place where he did not know whether a parent was home in that house. So it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And so again, I mean, we'll have to hear what the prosecution's theory of the case is, but suffice it to say, it doesn't make common sense. All right. What about the gun issue? There is a dispute about sort of whether Mr. Pankey owned a gun, whether he didn't own a gun. We believe the evidence is going to show pretty definitively that Mr. Pankey didn't own a gun in 1984. All right? I think there may be evidence that since that time, in the last few years perhaps, he has acquired some guns. But in 1984, I think the evidence is going to show he didn't own a gun. You're going to hear from Angela Hicks on this issue. She's made different statements on this issue. Initially, she told the police. She's talked to the police a lot. Angela Hicks has talked to the police a lot. She initially said, I know Steve had so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to back up for a minute. I apologize. I'm not going quite in chronological order here. But let me tell you a little bit about Angela Hicks and Steve Pankey. So Angela Hicks, formerly Angela Pankey, his ex-wife, they met when, in the late 70s, Steve was about 7 years older than Angela. Angela had recently, I think she may have been in her last year in high school when they met. They got married after she graduated. But she worked for some sort of communications center that kept track of security guards. And Steve was a security guard. He worked for I think it was called the Colorado Detective Agency, was the name of the company. But he worked at a cardboard box factory, okay? He patrolled a cardboard box factory. And I don't think there's gonna be any evidence that I think he had a weapon at that time. And I think it was a, bring your own weapon kind of thing, I believe. So I think he did own a weapon at that time when he worked for the Colorado Detective Agency. And so, I don't think there's any evidence that he ever fired it, used it. I guess we'll find out about that. But I don't, certainly at the cardboard box factory, I don't believe anyone ever got shot there. Anyway, and so then that's where they met, because at one night she couldn't, Angela was, worked at the communications center keeping track of the security guards, and they were supposed to call in, and Steve didn't call in when he was supposed to. In all honesty, he may have fallen asleep. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but she couldn't reach him at the cardboard box factory. So then I think she called actually the local police to check on him, and they found him, and he was fine. And then Steve called her and said, why'd you call the cops? I was fine, and they met, and the rest is history. They ended up getting married, and they were married for many years. I believe they were married over 20 years. But anyway, Angela Pankey / Hicks, she initially told the police that, I only know of Steve having that one gun from when he worked at the Colorado Detective Agency. And I remember early on in our marriage, he pawned it. And that's the only gun I'm aware of. He had a gun and he pawned it, okay? But more recently, apparently, having now prepared with the DA's office and I think wanting Steve to be convicted in this case. Judge, that's fair. That's a fair statement on my part.
I'm going to overrule. I would advise the jurors that these are statements of what they believe the evidence will show. You may continue.
She's now saying, Steve had a gun or multiple guns in our marriage and we went target shooting, blah, 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 okay? And so you're gonna have to decide, do you believe her the first time when she spoke to them, before Steve really became a suspect, or now that he's about to go to trial, do you believe her now? You'll have to decide, okay? But we believe the evidence is gonna show that Steve didn't own a gun in 1984, and you're gonna also hear from at least one witness that more recently, like in the last few years, when Steve went shooting with this person who was an expert marksman, Steve barely even knew how to shoot a gun. And this person had to teach him. All right. So the prosecution's case is based on circumstantial evidence, and I'm going to explain to you now why that isn't misleading. And we talked about circumstantial evidence is legitimate evidence, there's no question, but it's also more likely to be misleading than direct evidence, right? I mean, if there's a witness at the scene of the murder, that's direct evidence. I saw that person do it, and that's less likely to be misleading unless somehow there's a misidentification. But circumstantial evidence, where you're sort of building blocks to put the case together, that can prove a case, but it can also lead to the wrong conclusion, and it has in this case. All right, it has. So let me tell you why. So Angela Pankey / Hicks, I don't know. I'm sorry that print is kind of small. Can you guys see it? See that? Okay. I don't know if I can make it any bigger. Let me see. I don't know. I don't want to mess anything up, so I'm going to leave it alone. All right. So first of all, she's going to testify that she never, ever even considered him as a possible person who could have done something like this, meaning abduct and kill Jonelle Matthews. She never even thought of that until 1999, until 15 years later. 15 years later. She never So it wasn't like, oh, from 1984 till now, she's always had in the back of her mind, gee, I wonder if Steve did that. No, that didn't happen. She only started suspecting him in 1999 when, ladies and gentlemen, he told her, and I think I misspoke, I think I misprinted this here. What I wrote here is that the DA in Idaho wanted information from him regarding the Jonelle Matthews murder. Mr. Rourke said it was the police, and I think he's right on that. So it's actually the police who wanted information from him regarding the Jonelle Matthews murder, not the DA in Idaho. This is in Idaho now. So the Pankey family moved from Greeley in 1987. And then they kind of bounced around a little bit, and then in the 90s, they established themselves in Idaho, and Mr. Pankey lives in Idaho now. His ex-wife, Angela Hicks, lives in Idaho. Their son, Mark, lives in Idaho. All kind of in the same general area. And they've lived there for a while. So anyway, in 1999, Mr. Pankey starts making somewhat unusual statements. And one of them was, he said to his then wife, Angela Hicks, that the police want information from me regarding the Jonelle Matthews murder, and that's why I'm being charged with some other things. And you'll hear there were some other things he'd been charged with and prosecuted for, and he believed that he had been charged or he had been prosecuted because he had not given them information about where Jonelle Matthews' body was. He believed he knew where Jonelle Matthews' body was. So anyway, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but when he said that to Angela Pankey, the police want information from me about Jonelle Matthews' case. All of a sudden, not surprisingly, Angela Pankey goes, I wonder if you were involved in the Jonelle Matthews case. So, and then all of a sudden, all these memories start flooding back to her about all this strange conduct of Mr. Pankey's, which was 15 years ago. And actually, it was the prosecution yesterday who said, well, do you remember a specific day in your life, and do you have a specific memory of that? And everybody who was asked came up with different answers, but it generally appeared to be, the two that I can remember are the birth of my child and 9/11, right? Because birth of child, obviously a great personal experience, and 9/11 a great national tragedy. Anyway, but there was really very little unusual about the time frame when Jonelle Matthews was murdered in the Pankey household. All right? They drove to California, they drove back, and went about their lives. But all of a sudden, Angela Pankey has these memories about Steve did this, Steve did that, Steve did the other thing. And she is going to testify that that she believes, she recalls that Steve wanted to listen to the radio. And I think she's going to testify that the reason she recalled it is because they were never allowed to watch TV or radio or listen to radio in that house. So first of all, I am going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that Steve Pankey, he was kind of an overbearing husband, perhaps not the ideal spouse. Sort of believed that a man's house was his castle, and a man's wife needed to sort of obey the husband. He did think that. It was an old school thought. She'll testify, I believe, that his father was like that. His father was a minister of some kind, and I think she told the police that Steve's dad believed that if a man told his wife to get on the table in a bar and stand up naked and sing, that she should do that. that was Steve's dad. And so he comes by it honestly. That's the house he was raised in. And he was sort of like that too when they were married. So, you know, he did admittedly sort of call the shots, I think, in that household when they were married. Now she's going to say, but to say that he didn't want them to listen to the radio or watch TV, I believe is inaccurate. And I believe the evidence is going to show that, in fact, they had a TV. You'll see photos of it. It worked. They watched it. And that's just not true. So for her to say, oh, I remember this day because it was the only day we ever listened to the radio, I don't think that's going to be consistent with the evidence. It also doesn't really make sense because if Steve Pankey was really so interested in the Jonelle Matthews homicide, abduction or homicide, why wasn't he asking to listen to the radio on the way out? Because she says they only listened on the way back. So it doesn't fit. So what I've said here is, again, Angelo Pankey was angry at Steve Pankey for his overbearing nature, his failure to provide adequately for the family, and his mistreatment of her dad. So you're also going to hear evidence, I believe, that Mr. Pankey was not the best provider during the course of their marriage. He didn't make a ton of money, and they lived sort of hand to mouth. You're also going to hear he didn't really get along with Angela Pankey's father. I believe one of the statements that Mr. Rourke read during his opening statement was a statement from Mr. Pankey saying, I was surprised to see my father-in-law because I didn't really get along with him, and it's true. They didn't really get along. And Angela's going to say that Steve told her he didn't want her in contact with her dad. She had reason to be upset with him. She had reason to be upset with him, and she had reason to divorce him. But she doesn't have a reason to accuse him of committing a murder. All right, and so what you're going to hear is that many of the things that Angela Pankey talks about, as far as things she said Steve did, just don't line up with the other evidence in the case. And we'll all get to hear it over the next few weeks, and you can decide for yourselves whether you believe her testimony is credible or not. All right, what about Mr. Panky's statements? Mr. Pankey has never hidden his interest in the Jonelle Matthews case. He went to the police early on. He spoke to them. He loves these true crimes cases. People really like this stuff, and it's a legitimate sort of hobby, if you will. And this is what he likes. And so this happened in his town, at a time when he lived there, and it was interesting to him. So, he got involved, and one of the reasons he got involved was because of the third thing I say there, which is, and we sort of talked about this abstractly during voir dire, but he is a busybody. Steve Pankey is a busybody. He gets into people's business, all right? And again, I'm not here to say that that's a great quality, and I think we kind of all agreed during voir dire that it's probably not, but that's who he is. He gets in the middle of things. And when it comes to these true crime situations, he's particularly interested, and he gets particularly involved. So, and why does he do that? Well, you're going to hear that he does have a condition called Asperger's syndrome, in which, his mind doesn't process information exactly the same way that, sort of a conventional brain would do so, and and he processes information a little differently, and that causes him to get in the middle of these cases. I think, frankly, you're also going to conclude that that he also perhaps has a concerns about his own self-importance, and one way he builds up his own self-importance is to sort of get in the middle of these things. Now, you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear from a psychologist who's going to talk about this condition of Asperger's, but you're also going to hear from other people, non-experts, people who don't have a professional degree in the mental health field, who are going to say, yeah, I think Steve's kind of crazy, And, again, I don't know how the evidence is going to come out at trial, but I can tell you right now that Detective Cash and Detective Prill have both said during the course of this investigation, they think Steve's crazy. All right? And frankly, Steve's a little crazy. All right? He doesn't like it when I say that, but it's, frankly, Steve's a little crazy. All right? So, he gets involved in these things. And what you're going to hear is that this is not the only case he's gotten involved in, the Jonelle Matthews case. All right? You're going to hear that there was another case. There was another murder. A girl named Mary Pierce in the late 70s. And you're going to hear that he confessed to someone that he committed that murder. Or he confessed some involvement in that case, in that murder, which he didn't have, because you're going to hear that the person who did it is behind bars. That person was found through DNA evidence, by the way, I believe. Well, perhaps not, but that person was found, and that person was convicted, and that person is doing time. So he had no involvement in the Mary Pierce murder, and yet he professed some involvement in that to others. All right. Similarly, there's another case. It's called the Sarah Johnson case. It's in Idaho. And Steve worked, he worked for the coroner in this little town, Haley, Idaho. And the coroner's name is Russ Michael. You'll hear from him, I believe. And Mr. Michael was the coroner. Steve was like, the assistant to the coroner. And Sarah Johnson killed her parents. She killed her parents. Very, very infamous case in Haley, Idaho. None of us would never know about it because we don't read about Haley, Idaho generally, but for the fact that it dovetails with the case we're here for today. So what you're going to hear is that Steve somehow conveyed to the defense attorney for Sarah Johnson, who was, Sarah Johnson was the girl who killed her parents. He told her lawyer that he was at the scene of the murder, working for the coroner, and that he overheard the sheriff talk about planting evidence against Sarah Johnson. Okay? And that became a big deal because Sarah Johnson was convicted, and then the defense attorney wanted a new trial based on what Steve said, and Steve got himself all in the middle of it. He got himself up in everybody's business. All right? He's a busybody. All right? But the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, Russ Michael's going to say, I'm the coroner, and I can tell you, Steve Pankey wasn't even at that murder scene. Like, he was at the office. So he didn't overhear. I don't know exactly where Mr. Michael's going to say Steve was, but he's going to say he wasn't at the murder scene, and he couldn't have overheard the sheriff say this. Okay? But Steve got up in the middle of it and created a stir, and that's what happened. Again, he got himself involved in another case, another homicide. He said things to people that weren't totally true. He exaggerated his own self-importance and got kind of, got some publicity for himself. And it just wasn't true. It wasn't accurate. So, again, I'm going to ask you to consider all these things. We're going to ask you to consider the psychological evidence from a psychologist, trained psychologist, as well as the lay evidence from the people who have just observed Steve that he's a little bit crazy, he's a busybody, he's a true crime junkie, he gets himself in the middle of murder cases, but that doesn't necessarily mean he actually was involved in them. And he wasn't in this case. All right. So who really murdered Janelle? Tell you what. I'm going to hold off on that for a second. I have a few more things to say about Mr. Pankey's lack of involvement, all right? And I'm sorry, these are all kind of out of order, but these are in response to what Mr. Rourke said during his opening, so I just want to address them now. Get them on the table, all right? So, number one, all the statements that Mr. Rourke read to you, and all the statements you're going to hear about Mr. Pankey's so-called knowledge about this case, all have to do with his knowledge of where the body was. All right, and the very first line he read to you was something about Mr. Pankey did not want to reveal the location of Ms. Matthews' body. Because the evidence is that Mr. Pankey believed he knew where the body was. He believed he knew where it had been buried. He has never said that he was involved in the actual murder, that he committed it. All he's ever said, and admittedly he said it a lot, but all he's ever said is, I believe I know where the body is. Okay, and that's a difference. That's a difference, and it's an important distinction, all right? Because remember, that body was missing for 35 years. And he believed he knew where the body was, and he wanted, I believe, to tell people where he thought the body was so that the Matthews family could get closure. But he never said he knew that he was involved in the actual murder itself. You were also read a line about a blanket or quilt disappearing from the Matthews home. And Mr. Pankey made a statement about that. The blanket or quilt was just disappeared from the Matthews home. It's hard to forget something like that. So that was a lot. There was a letter that he wrote to the DA's office, and he wrote that. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. There was no blanket or quilt missing from the Matthews home. The evidence will show. There was no blanket or quilt missing from the Matthews home. All right? So again, it's like a figment of his imagination. All right, the footprints around the home, ladies and gentlemen. There were footprints. There was a rake. I went over the footprints. I believe Angela Pankey is going to say that she heard Steve say something about the footprints being raked. I know that the police and the prosecutors all say, well, this was a controlled piece of evidence and nobody else knew about it. There were other people who knew about it, all right? And you're going to hear from some of them. And if they don't call them, I'll call them as witnesses. But there are people who knew there were raked footprints. There were quite a few, all right? And so to say that, well, the fact that Mr. Pankey may have known about that shows that he was involved in the homicide, not true. Mr. Pankey identified himself as a Baptist minister. I mean, again, look, Mr. Pankey, you may disagree with this term, but Mr. Pankey tells white lies, okay? He does. Again, to elevate his own self-importance. He calls himself a Baptist minister. They're going to say, he said he had a degree in criminal justice when he didn't. Things that make him look better. So yeah, he did call himself he did say then he wasn't gonna go because there was a credit card instead of cash, but then he changed his mind and decided he was gonna go. But it wasn't like, oh, all of a sudden, we're gonna jump up and run to the parents' house because Jonelle Matthews was abducted. That wasn't the situation. He was gonna go, then he wasn't gonna go, and then he was gonna go. All right? And they went. All right? Mr. Pankey digging in the front yard when they got back. I believe the evidence is going to show that Greeley Police Department went into that yard, with shovels blazing and did not find a thing. All right? And we'll find out, I guess, when the evidence comes in, but, obviously he didn't, well, I don't know if this suggests, I don't know what they're trying to say, that he buried something in the backyard. Because if that is what they're trying to say, nothing was ever found. Why did the Pankey family leave? Why did the Pankey family leave Greeley in '87? Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you, and again, the Matthews will testify for themselves, but I believe they're going to say I think they left Greeley in '86. They were actually already gone. They left before Steve did. But '87, I mean, again, Steve bounced around. What you are going to hear is that the house that they lived in Greeley in '87 was owned by Steve's dad. Steve was supposed to make mortgage payments. Steve couldn't afford the mortgage payments on the house, and that's why he did that. Because the dad wanted the mortgage. The dad was kind of a hardliner too. He was kind of an overbearing man himself, and that. And it was tough love. It was like, Steve, this is my house. If you want to live in it, you have to pay me a mortgage. Steve couldn't afford it, and they left.
Mr. Vigorshi, you have 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Judge. Appreciate that. Again, to talk about Steve's desire to have a sense of self-importance. I mean, it's ironic, again, Mr. Rourke read the statements that Mr. Pankey listed a number of suspects, and he's like, John Gates, mayor of Greeley, this person, that person, and Steve Pankey, all right? Because, Steve Pankey he wants to be a person of interest, he wants to be spoken of in the same breath as the mayor of Greeley. That gives him a sense of self-importance. And let me tell you something else, ladies and gentlemen. It wasn't brought up during the opening, but I'll bring it up now. But the opening of the prosecution, which is that, and this is completely consistent with Steve's personality. He has run for public office 5 times in Idaho. All right. He has run for governor of Idaho. He has run for lieutenant governor of Idaho. He has run for sheriff of his county. I'm not sure if it's Haley County, or I'm not sure which county it was. But, and every time he's been roundly defeated in these elections. I believe he got kicked out of the party that it's supposed to be the Constitution Party, I believe he belonged to. I think he got kicked out of it, again, his overbearing personality. Or perhaps, well, I don't know, we'll find out. But he's run, and in his mind, I think he could become governor. I mean, I think he probably got 1,000 votes. But again, in his mind, he is the kind of person who should be governor. He wants to be an important person, and that's why he's always writing to the DA's office, or the newspaper, or podcast. Whoever will listen to him. When he wants a public platform that makes him sound important for something that he's never really had any knowledge of, ever. He's had a very sort of obsessive interest in the Jonelle Matthews case, and we admit that. And he had, as Mr. Rourke pointed out, a lot of searches on his phone. He's had an obsessive interest in the case, but he's never had any involvement in it. All right. So let me tell you who actually did this. Who murdered, and we haven't talked about this person yet. Who murdered Jonelle Matthews? Norris Drake. Norris Drake murdered Jonelle Matthews. That's what the evidence is going to show, and you're going to hear evidence about Norris Drake. Here's what we know about Norris Drake. In December of 1984, his mother, Frances Drake, lived across the street from the Matthews family, directly across the street. All right, he was in his early 30s, I believe. We'll get his exact date of birth, but I believe Norris Drake was in his early 30s at that time. So he was a man, he was a grown man, and his mother lived across the street. And his sister was staying there too. His sister, Peggy Drake, was also staying there. She was a grown woman, but she was living there. What else do we know? That on the night of December 20th, 1984, Norris Drake had dinner at his mother's house and then watched television with his mother and his sister Peggy. What else do we know? What else is the evidence going to show? That Norris Drake left his mother's house either right around the time Janelle got home or while she was at home, certainly while she was at home by herself. All right? So either he left right as Russ Ross was pulling in, he was walking out of the house, or she was already in the house and he left the house, looked across the street, and could see Janelle in there. What else? This is important, ladies and gentlemen. In contrast with Steve Pankey, who had zero interest in young girls, you will hear evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that Norris Drake had an interest in young girls who had recently reached puberty. Exactly what Janelle was. Exactly. You will hear from his ex-girlfriend, Andrea Davier, she was an adult woman, his age. But she will say, during the years that they dated, Norris Drake had an obsessive interest in young, post-pubescent girls. So, from the absence of any evidence of a struggle at the Matthews home, you'll be able to infer, ladies and gentlemen, that Norris Drake told Janelle that he was Frances's son and put her at ease, and then he asked her to go for a ride or use some other ploy to get her out of the house. So that's why there was no struggle, all right? Because Norris Drake, who's someone, at least whose mother she knew, and maybe she knew Norris too, got her to leave the house. Norris Drake got her to leave the house. And before leaving, he raked his snowy footprints and later admitted to Detective Keith Olson that he knew about the raked footprints. So I talked a moment ago about people who know that the footprints were raked. Norris Drake, ladies and gentlemen, knew that the footprints were raked. And then things went south with Janelle. We don't know exactly what happened. Can't really speculate too much about that, but we do know that he ended up shooting her and burying her in a field outside of town. And you're also going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that in contrast with Steve Pankey, who all the evidence shows he was home that night of December 20th, you're going to hear that Norris Drake was living with his friend Dave Davier. You'll get all these names straight eventually. But he was living at home with his friend Dave Davier, and that Dave had a sister named Connie Davier. Connie Davier was staying also with Dave that night. She was from out of town. She was staying at the house. And she will testify, ladies and gentlemen, that Norris Drake did not get home until the early morning hours of December 21st, 1984, sometime between 2 and 4. All right. So, for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, at the close of evidence, we are going to ask you to find that Steve Pankey is not guilty of the charges that have been leveled against him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yorst. Mr. Miller, let me call your first witness.
Thank you, Judge. The people call James Matthews to the stand.
Good morning, sir. If I could have you come forward here, please. Right here, and I'll have you stand for a moment and face me. If I could have you face me for a moment. Could I have you turn and face me for a moment, sir? Have you stand for a moment? If I have you stand for a moment, please. And have you raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm on a penalty of perjury the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome to have a seat. And if you desire while you're testifying, you're welcome to take your mask off.
Okay.
And then if we could turn that, thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, sir. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
I'm Jim Matthews. I live in the state of Washington, 77 years old.
And let's talk about the early 80s. Where all did you live in late 70s, early 80s?
In the late 70s, we were living in California. I moved from California to Greeley, took a job with Day Spring Christian School as Director of Development, and then wanted to go into administration, and so I went back and got my master's degree at UNC here in Greeley, and then started a career as a administrator in public education at that time.
And you said we moved. Who is we moved to Greeley?
That would be my wife Gloria, my daughter Jennifer, and my daughter Janelle.
And when did you marry Gloria?
1967,
And where were you guys living then?
Southern California.
Okay. And then you mentioned your daughter Jennifer. Is she your oldest daughter?
Yes,
Okay. When did you have her and where were you living when Jennifer was born?
and Jennifer was born in 1968. We were still living at that time in Camarillo, California, which is about an hour north of LA.
Okay. And then you mentioned Janelle. Describe when you had Janelle, or when you got Janelle through adoption.
Yeah, that was in 1972, probably be March of 72, because her birthday was the 9th of February,
Okay.
and we adopted her, got her physically in our home 6 weeks later, when she was 6 weeks old.
Okay. And eventually you guys end up moving to Greeley, Colorado.
Correct.
And describe your working in education and things like that. What other activities did you engage in?
Well, basically, the church was the center of our lives. I really enjoyed my job. I worked in 4 different school districts in Colorado, 3 when we were living in Greeley. And but the center of our lives was basically our church. We were at church almost every time the doors were open, and we were very involved.
And specifically here in Greeley, you moved here in 1978, is that correct?
Correct, 78,
And do you recall roughly when in 1978?
the summer.
Summer. And you've said the church a couple of times. Is that Sunnyview Church of the
Yes.
Nazarene? Is that
Yes.
Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene?
Yes.
Okay. And did you join that church almost immediately upon your arrival, or when did you join it?
Yes, we were Nazarenes in the state of California, and when we moved here, we went to First Church a couple of times, and then we tried Sunnyview, and decided that Sunnyview is where the Lord wanted us to be.
Okay. You said it was kind of the center of your social network. Can you describe that a little bit more for the jury?
Well, we were involved probably 3 or 4 times a week. It seemed like we were involved in Wednesday nights and Sundays and any other activities we had. And our girls were involved in Sunday school. They would put plays on. Velma Christie, who's the pastor's wife at Sunnyview, put on plays for like Christmas time, and Janelle was in those. And of course, Janelle, being the personality that she was, loved the limelight, and loved being a part of those. And so it was, our girls went to summer camps up in Golden Bill by Divide. And so it was, and the people of Sunnyview were some of our major support systems.
Okay. And aside from church activities at the church, did you host them at your house?
Yes, especially Sunday nights. A lot of times we would have a Sunday night service, and then we would have what we called an afterglow. And a lot of those afterglows were at our house.
Okay. Who were some of the people that attended it? We've heard some names today. Can you describe whether Russ Ross, did he come to those?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And he was a member of the Nazarene Church as well?
correct.
And you mentioned Pastor Christie or Pastor Christie's wife. Did he attend those, or did you attend?
Sometimes.
Okay. Who else?
Some of our other friends were Bonnie and Manuel Cisneros, the Rexfords, Judy Bands,
Okay.
go on.
So you moved to Greeley in summer of 1978. Do you buy a home right away, or how long did it take?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, we bought a home right away.
Can you describe that for the jury?
The home
Yes.
is a bi-level, 320 43rd Avenue Court. It was one of the first homes. The summer we moved in, I'd say maybe half the homes of Pheasant Run were completed. So it was really kind of in the beginning stages of the Pheasant Run development.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
You have the contact sheet. Sir, do you recognize that?
Yes,
And is that the home you were just talking about?
yes,
Is it a fair and accurate picture of the home?
yes.
Your Honor, this time I've moved to admit People's Exhibit 3.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibit 3.
May I publish, Your Honor?
You may.
And Mr. Matthews, if you look over your right shoulder, there's a picture on the screen. Can you describe what we're looking at there?
It's the front of our house, our two cars in the driveway, a tree that we had planted when we first moved in.
So you bought that house in 1978. Is it fair to say this picture is in 1984?
It would be fair, sure.
Okay. And the garage there, was that the kind of garage that have an automatic garage door?
It could,
Okay. But did it?
no.
Okay. And then it's a bi-level home. Can you describe it just from that picture? And we obviously have more pictures we're going to get into.
Sure.
Is it all right if he stands up, Your Honor? Just to kind of
You may.
point at the screen.
Okay. Now, this is the front door. If you walk in the front door, you reach it, can you hear me?
That was going to be my only concern. So if everyone can hear him, that's fine. If not, please let me know so we can have him speak into the microphone.
As you walk into the front door, you go to a landing, there's a coat closet, and then you either go upstairs to the living room, kitchen, and the girls' two bedrooms, or you go downstairs to a family room, and in the master bedroom, master bath, and as well as a small, what we call a sewing room.
Okay, thank you. I think you were talking about it earlier, but this is the beginning of Pheasant Run here in Greeley. Like, there's not a lot of houses. It's kind of in its infancy. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Can you go describe Greeley, how it was in 1984?
It was a great place to raise kids,
Why do you say that?
because it was kind of your typical Midwest small town, a place that my wife and I coveted being in. I grew up in Southern California, but couldn't wait to get out. And when the opportunity was open to move to Colorado, we took it.
Okay. You've talked about your involvement in the church and kind of getting involved in the Greeley community. What about sports? Were you or your kids involved in sports?
Yeah, they always were. Both of them, softball, basketball. I played sports in the church leagues and softball, basketball.
Okay. Now, I want to talk to you specifically about December 20th, 1984. Do you recall that date?
Yes,
And is that the date
yes,
that Janelle went missing?
yes.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 1. Do you recognize that?
Yes,
And what is it?
picture of my daughter.
Is it of Janelle?
Yes,
Okay. Is it a fair and accurate picture of Janelle?
yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd move to admit People's Exhibit 1.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibit 1.
May I publish, Judge?
You may.
Janelle's picture is over your right shoulder. You were kind of talking about her personality a little bit. Can you describe her more for the jury, who she was?
Well, there's already been a few adjectives to describe her: strong-willed, liked the attention, had lots of friends. If Janelle was in the room, you knew she was in the room. I'm very proud of her Latino background. And just a very lively young lady.
And you mentioned her Latino background. Did she know who her parents were, or her biological parents were?
No,
Okay. Thanks. So, December 20th, 1984, can you describe late afternoon in that day, what's going on at your household?
well, my wife and I, a few days before, had decided that she wanted to go see her parents, who she hadn't seen for a year or two, and her dad was not well. And so we decided that she would make a surprise visit and be with them for a few days leading up to Christmas. And so as a family, we had a visit, and this has already come up, had a very busy evening planned. And with activities of the two girls that have already been mentioned, the choir concert and the basketball game. And my wife had a flight out that evening, and we met down in the family room downstairs, had some cider, and we're talking about Christmas and how this is going to be a little bit different Christmas, obviously. And Janelle brought up the fact, Mom, what about Christmas? And Gloria said, we'll celebrate Christmas on the 26th. So at about 6 o'clock, a friend of hers from work picked her up to take her to the airport. A few minutes later, Jennifer left, and a few minutes later, Janelle and I left. We went to McDonald's for a hamburger, and then I took her to the Franklin Middle School, and I watched her get on the bus to go to the concert.
Okay. And then from there, where did you go?
Then from there, I went to Greeley Central for a basketball game that my daughter was participating in.
Okay. And approximately what time do you recall arriving at Greeley Central?
Approximately 6:30, 6:45 in that time frame.
And then you stayed and watched varsity and JV? Were they both playing that night?
No, I think basically I think the varsity started at 7. Don't quote me, I haven't thought about that for a long time, but I think the varsity game started around 7.
Okay. And you watched the entirety of the game. What time do you recall getting home?
I recall getting home at 9:30.
Okay. What did you observe when you got to the house?
When I got to the house?
Yeah, when you got home at 9:30.
Okay. The garage door was open.
Okay. Did you pull into the garage, or did you park on the driveway normally?
I think I pulled into the garage.
Okay. And then obviously you go in the house. Describe for the jury what happened when you went in the house that night.
Okay, we actually had two doors. We had the front door, and then we had the door leading in from the garage. I went through that, and I went downstairs, and I said, "Hi, Janelle," because I saw the quartz heater on, I saw her pantyhose and her shoes, where it looks like she probably just landed, came in, and put these things to be more comfortable. And then I didn't hear anything, and I thought, well, maybe she's upstairs in her room. So I went into my room, and I had purchased some leather gloves from my janitor at Platte Valley Elementary. And so I went into the sewing room and wrapped that present for the janitor to take to school the next day. The next day was a Friday, and the last day before Christmas vacation. And then, so I put that aside, and then I went back upstairs and to see if Janelle was up there, and obviously she was not. And I happened to then go into the kitchen and notice a note that Janelle had written that I think we've already seen this morning, that one of my sixth grade teachers needed a sub. She was sick. So I called. That was one of my jobs as a principal, is to call subs when my teachers are sick. And so I did that. And then about that time, Jennifer came home, and right around 10 o'clock. And I asked her if she'd seen, if she knew where Janelle was. She said no. Our girls were very good about letting us know, either writing notes or calling us or whatever, if they were going to have a change of plans. And so I started really getting concerned then. This was not like Janelle, and so I called Russ Ross, and Russ told me that he had brought Janelle home and had watched her walk into the door, turn the light on, and that's when he left.
Okay. Did he describe whether the garage door was open or not to you, or did you even ask that?
Of Russ?
Yeah.
No, I didn't ask him.
Okay. So you said you were concerned before you called Mr. Ross. After you talked to him, what steps did you take, or what did you do?
Well, then I called Pastor Christie and just let him know that I didn't know where Janelle was and that I was really getting concerned. And he asked me if I'd called some of her friends, and I hadn't at that time, other than Russ Ross. And I then, he said, well, don't wait too long to call the police. And so it was probably, I think I had called maybe one or two of her friends and didn't get an answer at one, and talked to another, and they didn't know anything about Janelle. And that's when in that time frame, I decided to call the police.
Okay. And did police ultimately show up at your house?
Yes, within about 15 or 20 minutes, yeah.
Within 15 or 20 minutes?
I think that was
Okay.
about the time frame.
Okay. Describe what happened when police arrived at your house that night.
Well, obviously we started discussing the fact that my daughter was missing, and they had asked me if I had called anybody, and I said yes, I had called, and then they started doing a search, asked me some preliminary questions, and then they decided to start a search into the house.
Okay. And were they, taking pictures of the inside of your house and
Yes.
outside and things like that?
Yes.
And I can't recall if you said it, but the address of that house, what was it? Do you recall?
320 43rd Avenue Court.
And that's here in Greeley, Colorado?
Yes, Pheasant Run.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Maybe we'll just do 3 or 4 at a time. 25 through 31. Hand me what's been marked as People's Exhibits 25 through 31. If you could just look through them real quickly.
Starting with 25?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I would have seen just walking through the garage door into the landing. This is what I'd see down in the family room.
And Mr. Matthews, if you want to just look at them, and then I'll just ask if you recognize them, we'll put them on the screen if that's all right.
Sure. The next one is, actually, you can see the stairs going up to the landing. So it would be from the opposite direction as that first one. And that's the chair and quartz heater, and the clothing of Janelle's on the couch.
And I'll just ask you, do you recognize the picture? Do you recognize 25, 26, and 27?
Yes,
Okay. Are they fair and accurate pictures of the inside of your home?
yes, sir.
This time I'd move to admit 25, 26, and 27.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibits 25 through 27.
And then, sir, if you could look at 28, 29, 30, and 31 and let me know if you just recognize them, and then we'll put them on the screen for you to describe.
Yes,
And are they fair and accurate pictures of the
Yes,
inside
sir.
of your residence? Okay. This time I'd move to admit 28, 29, 30, and 31.
No objection, Your Honor.
Court receives into evidence People's 28 through 31 inclusive.
And if we could publish People's 25?
You may.
And Mr. Matthews, I think you were describing this a second ago. Can you re-describe it now that the jury can see the picture?
sure. That's what I would have seen on the landing from the garage door entrance into the house. Yeah,
Okay. People's 26?
that's from the opposite direction, looking to the couch and the chair, where the chair is probably where Janelle would have landed, with the quartz heater and a few of her clothing garments, pantyhose.
And I think you mentioned the stairs at the upper right-hand corner.
Yes, yes,
Are those the stairs we were looking down in 25?
correct.
Okay. People's 27? And describe what we're seeing here.
Okay, that's very, that's from basically the same direction as the one just before that.
And it just catches more of the Christmas tree to the
Yes,
right side
yes,
of the picture?
yeah.
Okay. People's 28? What do we see?
That's, I'm sorry?
What is this a picture of?
That would be going up the stairs to the living room area.
Okay, so that's the top level of the bi-level
Yes,
house?
yes.
Kind of a sitting area, living room sort of
Yep.
place? Okay,
Yes.
people's 29?
That is, if you were standing in the living room, looking into our kitchen,
Okay, so the room we were just looking
on
at,
the upper level.
okay, upper level. And people's exhibit 30?
That's our daughter Jennifer, I think that's our daughter Jennifer's door to her room.
And that hallway's right off that living room
Yes,
with
yes.
like the colorful chair in that?
Right.
Okay. And is Janelle's room in that picture?
Janelle's room would be just to the right, before you get to the door of Jennifer's room.
People's 31?
That's another picture of the living room.
And is that on the left of people's exhibit 31, is that the kitchen we saw a picture of
Yes.
earlier?
Yeah, the kitchen, you can see I think that's the refrigerator. Yeah.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm handing you what are people's exhibits 32, 33, and 34. If you could just let me know if you recognize those.
Yes.
And what are the pictures of? The inside of your house?
Yeah, the first one again is the living room. The second one is a picture of the phone that we've already been talking about, where the message was left by Janelle talking to Sandy, snap. And the third one is a picture of our stove and refrigerator in the kitchen, when you can see a little bit on the right of the living room.
Okay, and are they fair and accurate photos of your house that night?
Yes.
You know, at this time, I'd move to admit people's 32, 33, and 34.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibits 32 through 34.
If we may publish 32. And sir, if you could look over your right shoulder again, describe what we see here.
That's the living room with the two windows looking out the front of the house.
Okay. And if we could publish people's 3. So, Mr. Matthews, those windows, are those the ones that we see in that picture from the upstairs, or are they looking into the backyard?
No, that's looking in the front, and that, the one window to the right would be a window from Janelle's room.
Okay. And then the 2 windows to the left on the upstairs is the main living room?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. If we could publish people's 33. Can you describe that for the jury?
Yes, that's, again, the phone with a slate board on it that Janelle wrote the message from one of my teachers, Sandy Snap, that she needed a substitute.
And if we could zoom in on that. So is that the note?
Yes.
And was that common? You or other family members would leave notes on there to let people know where you were?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that your daughters were good about communicating. Was that one of the ways they'd communicate with you?
Yes.
Okay. And I see, it looks like Janelle wrote stamp, but you didn't have anyone by that name, so you went with
Yes.
Sandy Snap. Okay.
Yes.
And people's 34?
That's a picture of our stove and refrigerator, and then the entrance leading into the living room.
And on the far right of that photograph, is that the phone we just saw in the last exhibit?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Certainly. Sir, I'm handing you what's been marked as people's 35, 36, and 37.
Do you recognize those photos?
Yes.
And again, are they photos of the inside of the house?
Yes.
Okay. Are they fair and accurate pictures?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I move to admit people's 35, 36, and 37.
No objection?
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's 35 through 37.
If we could publish people's 35. Mr. Matthews, can you describe what we're looking at in that photograph?
Well, Janelle really liked this group. I'm trying to think of what the name of the group was, but I'm sorry, I can't
Is it
remember.
Menudo?
Yes, okay. Yeah, and it's also a kind of a throw blanket, and the window in her room.
Okay, so that's Janelle's bedroom.
Yes,
And that throw blanket, Mr. Matthews, was that usually kept downstairs?
yes,
Okay, so it was uncommon, I guess, for it to be in Janelle's room, or it's out of place there, I guess.
yes.
Okay. People's 36. Same room, Janelle's room?
Yes.
And what else is in this photograph?
The humidifier, Janelle had missed the previous 2 days of school. We have a rule in our house that if you don't go to school, you don't go to activities. And so she really wanted to get back to school, and we allowed her to go to school that day, which meant then, of course, that she could participate in that concert. But that was a leftover from her previous 2 days of having a cold. And
Okay. So she went to school that day and then therefore
Yes.
got to go to the concert that night?
Yes.
Okay. People's Exhibit 37. Can you describe what we see in this photograph?
That's a coat closet.
And would Janelle keep her coats in that closet as well?
Yes,
And it looks like there's an empty hanger there.
yes,
Okay. Is that where she commonly hung her coat, or likely?
yes.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you People's Exhibits 38 through 41. Could you just take a look at them and let me know if you recognize them?
Yes,
And are they more pictures of the inside of your residence?
yes.
If we could start with People's Exhibit, sorry. Your Honor, at this time, I'd move to admit 38 through 41.
No objection?
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibits 38 through 41.
We might publish People's 38? Can you describe for the jury this viewpoint of the inside of your residence?
This would be looking up from the landing, looking up into the living room,
The upstairs level,
upstairs level.
okay. And then People's 39? Describe this perspective.
That would be looking from the garden level up the stairs, and that would be the door to the garage.
Okay.
And the door to the front room, or the entrance door to the front of the house would be just to the left of that.
To the left of the door at the top?
Right.
Okay. People's 40?
Again, that would be a picture of the downstairs family room.
Okay. And People's 41?
Same thing.
And Mr. Matthews, you kind of touched on it and said this picture has been shown, but I want to walk through it with you. In that photograph, there's a pair of shoes. Do you know whose shoes those were?
I believe there's Janelle's.
Okay. Did she wear them to the choir concert that night?
I believe so.
Okay. And then you mentioned a pair of tights or pantyhose. Is that what she wore to the concert that night?
Yes.
Okay. And then you talked about the court's heater. Was that on when you got home from?
Yes.
Okay. And then do you recall if the TV was on or not?
No, I don't. I honestly don't recall.
Okay. And did you know Janelle was giving friends at school gifts or preparing gifts for friends at school?
Yes, and I think it was already mentioned that she'd love to do needlepoint.
Okay. And is that what she was making for her friends at school?
Yes.
Okay. If I may approach, Judge.
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you what's been marked as People's Exhibits 42 through 45. If you could just take a look and see if you recognize those.
Yes, I recognize.
And are they more pictures of the inside of your residence?
Yes, the downstairs.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'd move to admit People's 42 through 45.
No objection?
Thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibits 42 through 45 inclusive.
And Mr. Matthews, I want to spend a couple more minutes with this picture. The box on top of the coffee table there in People's Exhibit 41, can you describe what that is for the jury?
It's a cable box.
So it's the old style cable box that you'd use to change channels if you were sitting there?
Yes.
Okay. People's if we could publish People's 42. Again, I believe it's a similar picture, but a little bit different angle.
Yes.
And I see a stereo kind of off to the left of Exhibit 42, and it looks like a door frame behind it. What's over there?
Well, it's got to be the sewing room.
Okay. Is that where you went to wrap the present for your janitor?
Yes.
Okay. People's 43. And then is that the sewing room you were just referring to?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury what all's in that room that's unable to see, that we're unable to see?
That we're unable to see?
Well, what all is that room used for, I guess? Let me ask it that way.
That would either be like a sewing room or doing ironing and
Okay,
kind of a catch-all room.
okay. And People's 44?
That's the table that I wrapped the present on.
Okay. Is that the ribbon and everything you used on December 20th?
Yes.
People's 45?
That would be looking into the bathroom tile on the floor.
Is that in your master bedroom?
Yes.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Penny, what's been marked as People's Exhibits 46, 47, and 48. I mean, if you could take a look at those and let me know if you recognize those.
Yes.
And are they more pictures of the inside of your house?
Yes.
And are they fair and accurate pictures?
Yes.
Your Honor, this time I'd move to admit 46, 47, and 48.
No objection?
Thank you. Court receives into evidence 46 through 48.
And if we could publish People's 46. Mr. Matthews, what is that a picture of?
It's a master bedroom.
And so in this house, the master bedroom was downstairs?
Correct.
Okay. And the kids were upstairs?
Correct.
So you go down there and wrap a gift in a room, is it attached to that?
Yeah, the door that you see on the right-hand side leads into the bathroom, and then, which then leads into the sewing room.
Okay. And People's 47? What is this a photo of?
This would be the master bedroom.
Okay. And People's 48?
Just a blown-up view of the storage box and the
No.
basket.
Okay. And again, this is in the master bedroom?
Yes.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Handy what's been marked as People's Exhibits 49 through 51. If you could just take a look and see if you recognize those.
Yes.
And are they more pictures of the inside of your house?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I'd move to admit People's 48 through 51.
No objection?
Excuse me, 49 through
49,
50.
thank you. Court receives into evidence People's Exhibits 49 through 51.
If we could publish People's 49. Who's that a picture of?
Janelle and my wife Gloria?
And is it next to that basket that we saw in the previous photograph in your
Yes.
bedroom? Okay. It's one of the few pictures Janelle's not smiling in. It looks like she doesn't want to take that photo.
Right.
People's Exhibit 50.
The chest of drawers, my wife's jewelry box, and also looking into the, that old-time desk would be in the family room.
Okay, so that's looking back out into the family
Right.
room? And a couple more things on that, with the chest. It looks like, is that where you went first and put your, whose wallet is that?
That's mine.
Okay. Was it common when you got home to go in there and empty your pockets, so to speak?
Yes.
Okay. And then People's 51?
It's a more close-up view, yeah.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you People's Exhibits 52 through 56. If you could just take a look at those. See if you recognize them.
Yes.
And are they more pictures of items inside your residence?
Yes.
Are they fair and accurate pictures?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd move to admit People's 52 through 56.
No objection?
Thank you. Court receives no evidence. People's exhibits 52 through 56 inclusive.
And if we could publish People's 52? What is this, Mr. Matthews?
That's the top of my wife's jewelry box.
Okay. And obviously, the original picture is of the box put together. Would this be taking a tray out of it, do you recall?
Yes.
Okay. And then People's 53? Would this be what's under the tray?
Yes.
And describe what's in there.
Some letters, notes, some old coins.
Okay. And People's 54? Is that a similar picture with the
Yes.
notes it looks like moved?
Yes.
Was anything ever found missing out of that box?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. People's 55?
That's master bathroom.
Okay. And then People's 56?
That would be, as you came in from our room, you turn left, you'd see what you saw in 55. If you turned right, you'd see the washer dryer.
Okay. Thank you. Your Honor, I think if we want to take a lunch break now,
Sure.
this would be a good
Certainly.
spot.
So ask everyone to please be back at 1:30. And I'll advise you again that until the trial is completed, you must not discuss this case with anyone, and include your family, people involved in the trial, other jurors, or anyone else. If someone approaches you and tries to discuss the trial with you, please let me know about it immediately. It's also important that you must not read or listen to any news reports of the trial. Do not in any way try to gain any information about this case outside of the courtroom. That includes refraining from researching on the internet, medical law books, encyclopedias, or dictionaries. The social media advisement continues throughout the trial. Finally, it is especially important that you do not form or express any opinion on the case until it is finally submitted to you. So with that, please, back to the jury room at 1:30, please. Thank you. Please rise.